Hey, Fungi friends. I am back to read you Chapter 5 of my book, Passport to Kingdom Fungi. Today, I'm going to be reading about mushroom foraging. And it's a good one because foraging is really what got me into mushrooms and what keeps me motivated to continue learning about them and get outside and really just kind of like move with the rhythms of the season as to what mushrooms are out there and what you can find. And I think that's sort of one of the best things to have come into my life from mushrooms is that connectedness to the seasons, to the weather, to the different habitats and zones and areas I go and hunt for different mushrooms in, depending on what time of year it is and what the weather has been like. So yeah, I'm excited to read this chapter, and I think it's a good one. There is more follow-up stuff, obviously, about foraging as it pertains to particular types of mushrooms later in the book in the mushroom profiles, but this is sort of my advice in a general sense about how to forage mushrooms and a little bit of the theory and things like that, because it's hard to give advice that is relevant to everyone everywhere. And that was very much my intention with this book, was to try to make it useful for pretty much everyone, regardless of where they lived. And it's primarily focused on North America, but in theory, a lot of the stuff in this book is relevant worldwide. And so that was kind of my idea behind it. Again, I'm going to remind you guys, I have no sponsors. I am not being paid to do this. This is just me trying to make my book more accessible to people by recording this sort of free, unofficial audio version of the book. So if you like what I'm doing, please pick up a copy of Passport to Kingdom Fungi. That's my book by Dr. Gordon Walker. And if you like listening to this or watching this, depending on what platform you're on, please go ahead and leave a review or a comment, because it helps other people find this. And if you are enjoying this, please feel free to send it to your friends and family, and again, anyone who you think might learn from this. So we're going to get reading on Chapter 5, which is Mushroom Foraging 101, Where, When, and How to Collect Mushrooms. For many people, the most exciting thing about mushrooms is their culinary value. However, finding and correctly identifying them can be a challenge. Foraging for wild mushrooms requires not only an intimate knowledge of the seasons and specific habitats, but also a discerning eye for morphology and the confidence to properly identify your finds. Learning to recognize plant-fungi associations and keeping tabs on the weather will lead to a higher rate of success when you're looking for edible mushrooms. This chapter covers tips, tricks, and advice for finding wild mushrooms, including my personal best practices for harvesting. Keep in mind, it's virtually impossible to make any completely true generalizations about mushrooms, so the rules and best practices for individual species may vary on where and what you forage. And I'd say that's all very true. Okay, so first question starts out by asking, what are the best places to find mushrooms? And this is, a lot of these questions in the book and the way this was structured came out of me doing live streams and interacting with people on the internet and knowing what types of questions would come up again and again. And so I get this a lot where I'm streaming and someone chimes in or leaves a comment on a video and says, hey, what about the mushrooms in X place that I live? And I often say, I'm not sure. I haven't been there. I don't know that. But I'm trying to give people advice on how to like learn themselves. And so this is part of what I'm doing with this chapter. What are the best places to find mushrooms? Well, the best habitats to find a broad diversity of mushrooms are forested areas with a mixture of different tree species. And that was a very general way of saying, go to the woods. Healthy forest ecosystems support a wide diversity of mushrooms. And again, that's because there tends to be a mixture of both saprotrophic and ectomycorrhizal mushrooms in a forest ecosystem. The combination of trees, abundant decaying organic matter, and copious amounts of rainfall and moisture encourage mushroom growth. Mushrooms tend to fruit in microclimates within the forest, often in proximity to specific plant species, i.e. like the tree that they're associated with, or under certain bushes, because it creates a nice little microhabitat. Learning to identify trees and other plants will help you focus on specific areas, greatly increasing your chances of finding the best edible mushrooms. And that's, to the point that like if you want to hunt a particular mushroom, it helps to be in the right tree type. If you want to find porcini in California, it helps to be under pine or oak. And if you're hunting in a different habitat, you have a lower chance of finding them because they're not associated with that tree type. Or maybe there's a particular species associated with each tree type. And in that case, helps know where you're going, what you're doing, where you should be looking. And that's kind of the point here. The more you learn about the forest as a whole, the more you can use your intuition to find particularly productive mushroom patches. And again, that's if you happen to know you're, well, I'm in pine habitat, but over here, there's like more mushrooms than there are over there. And then you sort of start to say, well, maybe it's because there's like a little bit of a low-lying dip. And as you learn patterns, and then it becomes your sort of inherent mushroom intuition, you can follow that. But when you're first getting started, you just have to get in the right spot and then kind of learn and feel it out. And that's kind of what I'm getting at here. Well, forests tend to have the widest selection of mushrooms. You can also find a huge diversity of species associated with grasslands, chaparrals, deserts, mountains, and even urban habitats. And there's mushrooms to find everywhere. It's depending on what types of mushrooms and how many and what season and all that kind of stuff. Often, it's just a matter of learning how to spot moist areas that provide the perfect conditions for the formation of fruiting bodies. And that's true. I've traveled around the world. I've been in many different habitats, and people are always sort of astounded that I can find a mushroom. And it's simply because I've gotten used to seeing, all right, there's a little drainage channel here. I've also done a lot of mushroom hunting in areas that are not so good or don't have a ton of moisture. And what you learn to do is find little micro habitats and climates that have some moisture, and then start doing some digging, or kind of like, looking at the base of a tree or things like that, that just kind of lead to a higher success of finding a mushroom. So, what kind of weather is best for mushrooms? The main ingredient you need for mushrooms is moisture. Whether that comes in the form of rain, fog, or melting snow depends on where you are in the world and the type of habitat you are hunting in. If you want to be a successful mushroom hunter, you need to pay attention to the weather and the seasons, particularly daily temperatures, rainfall, and relative humidity. The time of year will help inform you about what kinds of mushrooms you should be looking for. In general, the best time to hunt mushrooms is 1 to 3 days after a heavy soaking rain. This gives new mushrooms time to grow and mature before they dry out. Most mushrooms tend to fruit best with moderate temperatures between 50 and 85 degrees Fahrenheit and humidity above 80%. And those are variable things. The humidity can be lower, and it can be a little warmer or even a little colder, but usually outside of those ranges, mushrooms aren't having such a good time. Certainly when it's wetter, mushrooms like to come up, but they get soggy really quickly too. And that's what I mean, is sometimes it's best to go out, not like the day it rained or even the day after it rained, but give it a day or two for the growing mushrooms to actually like become substantial instead of just being tiny little pins. And if you do go out right after rain, you're going to find a lot of larger mushrooms that have gotten totally sogged out and might be moldy. So it pays to kind of like give it a little bit of time for that rain to soak in. The majority of mushrooms will not grow when it is freezing or when conditions are very dry or hot, although there are specifically or especially adapted species and exceptions, because there's like desert mushrooms, and there's things that'll fruit underground or mostly covered, and so they're less prone to uh, being sensitive to like really dry conditions or something like that. Saprotrophic species, which are the decay-associated species, tend to actively fruit during rainy, wet conditions, while mycorrhizal species can emerge up to several weeks after a major rain event. And that's a really important point, because if you do go out right after rain, most of what you tend to see, especially if it hasn't been raining recently, you see saprotrophic species coming right up, because their mycelium is at the surface in the duff, in the wood, and it gets wet, and they form a mushroom right away. Mycorrhizal stuff tends to come in later, because their mycelium is a little bit deeper in the ground. It's associated with the roots of a tree, and there's probably some sort of like nutrient exchange, source sink relationship stuff that has to happen for the tree to send energy down to the mycelium of those mycorrhizal species, and then form fruiting bodies, which then have to push up through the soil and form little nodes and then become full-grown mushrooms. And that can take, upwards of 1, 2, 3 weeks after a big rain event, especially if it hasn't been wet continuously. So that is a pattern I've seen, and that's why I put it in the book, is that saprotrophic stuff comes up right after rain, and it'll continue to come up if it keeps being wet. But if it, have 1 or 2 big rain events and then things dry out, you can still find mycorrhizal species like 2 to 3, 4 weeks later, because they're coming up from moisture that is sunk into the ground. Many of the large, fleshy, edible polypores can form fruiting bodies regardless of rain, drawing on moisture deep from in their woody substrate. And that's a good point, because there's been years where it's been really dry, and I've still been able to find stuff like chicken of the woods fruiting, because the moisture is in the wood, the trunk, whatever the the polypores growing out of. And so sometimes in droughts and dry years, that's going to be the only kind of mushroom you find is like one big polypore. And certainly you'd find more of them. They might be bigger if it was a wetter year, but often there's enough moisture in a stump or a trunk for one of those sort of perennial things to show up, just because that's how they do business. So, is it worth looking for mushrooms if it has not rained recently? I sort of gave you a spoiler, but yeah, even when it's dry, there is still tremendous value in learning about the habitats where you hunt and the seasonal patterns of mushrooms that grow there. Checking your spots regularly while taking note of what you see will help you develop some intuition for which areas will be good for finding mushrooms in the future. And that's, you go for a hike when it's not good, and you can get a sense of like, oh, this area looks like it might be good when there's more rain. Pay attention to plant species associated with edible mushrooms, i.e., like there's trees that you want to hunt mushrooms under. Catalog them, think about them, make a post on INAT and remind yourself this would be a good spot. So you can, pay attention to plant species associated with edible mushrooms so you can tag certain spots to visit again when conditions are more ideal. That's exactly what I'm saying. While cool, wet weather is usually best for a fungal bonanza, the variety of fungi means there's almost always something to find. When conditions are less than ideal, it's best to switch your focus from searching for edible mushrooms to observing tiny ascocups, cryptic crusts, lichens, and slime molds. And that's the thing. I love mushroom hunting, but I know well enough that it's easy to get disappointed if you're not finding baskets full of edible mushrooms. You get a little spoiled, and so you have to sort of shift what you're looking for from saying, well, I'm going to go home with like X number of pounds of mushrooms, to say, you know what, maybe I'll just take some really nice pictures of stuff by like flipping logs and getting low to the ground and paying attention to tiny things, because that can be really fulfilling and exciting. You just have sort of changed the mindset that like I'm coming home with dinner to I'm coming home with maybe some cool specimens that I could study, or nice photos, or just, appreciate the time in nature rather than sort of expecting this extractive thing that you're beginning, have a certain amount of tangible mushrooms. But it's always worth going out, and it's good for your mental health. Just get outside, right? That's always a plus. So, what seasons are best for finding mushrooms? Each geographic region has its own seasonal arc for mushrooms. Some mushrooms tend to have a very short season, like ephemeral morels, morchella, popping up for a week or two in the spring, whereas chanterelles tend to have long seasonal arcs, growing for many months. And oyster mushrooms can fruit whenever conditions are advantageous. So chanterelles can fruit, many months at a time, especially if it's sort of Pacific Northwest and there's a lot of fog drip or just moisture in the air. Whereas most morels come up for like, a fairly short period of time in the spring when like the temperature conditions are just right. California is lucky because we have mountains, and so you can start hunting morels like at the end of March, when things start warming up down at 3,000 feet. And if you were doing it right, you can hunt mushrooms, or morels particularly, well into, May, June, even if you're going up higher and higher, all the way up to like 10,000 feet, depending. And that's a thing that you don't get to do in like the Midwest, where there tends to be a lot of morels for like a week or two at a time, but then the season's over because it's pretty flat and there's not a lot of elevation out there. There's exceptions, I'm sure, but that's sort of the general pattern. So, and yeah, mushrooms are saprotrophic. So if it rains, they're like, woohoo, bonanza, we're going to fruit. And that was just sort of three different things I had in mind here. And what I wanted to do for this chapter was to have a figure where I had seasonal arcs of all these different mushrooms, but it was very difficult because the season on like the West Coast is sort of the opposite from the East Coast, and there's nuances of like alpine seasons versus stuff in the Midwest versus the Southeast. And so I couldn't make one that was generally applicable for all of North America. And I still hope to, but in some sense, the best thing you can do is go to iNaturalist and search for mushrooms in your area and when they're fruiting, because that's going to be more specific to where you live than anything I could possibly put in a book. And rather than this sort of like generalized thing that wasn't true, I was like, I'm going to teach people how to do this rather than trying to give them a resource that ends up not being as useful as you'd want it to be. That was my thought process. So, but I do talk about, the general seasonal arcs for different areas. So for in general, temperature and rainfall tend to dictate when particular species will appear. Thus, the best season to find mushrooms depends on where you live and what types of habitat you have access to. For much of North America, including the eastern seaboard, Midwest, and Southeast, the seasonal arc for mushrooms tends to start in spring and run through the fall until heavy frost and snow returns, usually from April till the end of October. And again, that's a little variable depending on where you are and what your latitude is, all that kind of thing. This trend is similar for other temperate regions in Europe and Asia in the northern hemisphere. And again, opposite for southern. But temperate regions in the southern hemisphere display a similar seasonal arc for mushrooms, but at the opposite calendar time of year, generally between December and May. For the coastal areas of the Pacific Northwest and Northern California, the seasonal arc starts in late summer with fog drip, peaks in fall and winter, and runs through spring depending on rainfall and snow, generally August to February. And again, that's sort of the opposite timing of the mushroom season in much of the rest of the country. So those are sort of general thoughts on when and how and where you can find mushrooms. I continue it here and say, montane and alpine habitats have their own seasonal arc that is dependent on elevation, exposure, snowmelt, and relative soil temperature. Generally, these habitats are most active during late spring and summer, May to September. Subarctic regions can have short but prolific mushroom seasons, usually in mid to late summer around July to September. And what I mean is Alaska and northern parts of Canada. Dry, arid desert regions don't necessarily have a defined mushroom season, but whenever rain does fall, there will be activity. And that's just, in the desert, when there's rain, things spring to life and then they kind of dry out. But there are, again, some specialized like desert mushrooms that can fruit, after rain and hang out in the sand. That's how they kind of have their lifestyle. So in warm, wet, tropical, and subtropical regions near the equator, mushrooms are virtually always in season. And that's a thing you see in like Central America and things like that, where there's a lot of rainfall, it's continuously warm. There's not a defined mushroom season. There are ways like, when you have wet, dry seasons, but you get lots of mushrooms that are fairly small and pretty colorful. And that's a common theme you see in like tropical areas. And I just think that's kind of cool. Let's see, I'm trying to decide which of these things to read next. I'm going to read a little sidebar here from my friend Gabrielle Serberville. She's also known as Chaotic Forager, the mushroom auntie of the internet. Gabrielle's a friend and a phenomenal forager, and I've learned a lot from her. She's also a music composer and is in graduate school right now for music composition, but not in like a traditional sense. She does this really cool sort of like, oh gosh, I don't even know how to describe it. She does like visual mock-ups of a composition, and the musicians she works with are able to like look at the sort of visual flowchart roadmap she's created in this artistic sense and play off of that as like a visual composition, which is really neat and interesting. And Gabrielle's also really knowledgeable about like doing, I think we should call biosonification, basically like plugging electrodes into plants or mushrooms and things like that, and like reading the electrical signals and then producing noises and stuff out of that. And so I asked her nothing related to that, but about foraging, and I was glad that she decided to be part of my project here because I wanted to feature her voice in this book. So I asked, what are your favorite habitats for mushroom hunting, and how can foragers help protect them? So Gabrielle said, my favorite mushroom hunting habitat depends significantly on what I'm hunting for. Great answer. But by far the most preferable to me is some kind of mixed old-growth forest. True old-growth forests have had hundreds, if not thousands, of years to develop strong ectomycorrhizal relationships with trees and fungi, and forest environments that have been left relatively undisturbed by industry are treasure troves of nature's bounty. Foragers have always been active members of the natural world as environmental stewards. Due to irresponsible corporate practices like deforestation and pollution, combined with a decline in outdoor education, it's more vital than ever that foragers stress the importance of protecting threatened habitats. As thoughtful foragers, we must recognize that our food needs must be proportional to our environmental responsibilities, and when we care for and advocate for the places that provide our meals, we can help keep the ecosystem healthy and balanced. And so what she's saying is that foragers have a role, stewardship role inherent in the role of foraging and being out in nature to protect and respect the places where we gather our food. And she thinks old growth forests are the bee's knees as a place to go foraging. And I agree, because you have the most biodiversity there. Sometimes though, second growth forests can actually be better for certain types of mushrooms simply because of like a forest age thing. And I know that there's a particular age at which like chanterelles in a Doug fir forest will really flourish. And that's often something you see in like forests where the trees are going to get logged because they planted them all at the same time. And something like 25, 30 years in, they hit like peak maturity for like really good time to pick chanterelles. But that often means that the trees have then matured and are ready to be cut down by the timber company that owns the land and the trees. And it's really disheartening as a forager to be like, oh my God, like my best spot got logged and now they're all gone. Um, and that's just the flow of the world. But we as foragers can play a role in advocacy and land stewardship, and just helping to report what's happening out there because people don't always go outside or always go to the same areas that foragers do. So there's a positive role that foragers can play for sure. Okay, I'm going to keep reading this, and there's a sidebar here with some common sort of mushroom rules and stuff I'll come back to. So, what are your tips for finding mushrooms? The best way to find mushrooms is to think like a mushroom. Mushrooms tend to fruit in damp areas with well-draining soil and lots of organic material. As you walk around the woods, look for areas with more moisture like streams, drainage channels, low-lying areas, and shaded spots. Fruiting bodies tend to form along the drip line of trees and under dense foliage. So again, you can look right around the edge of sort of where the foliage of the tree hits the ground. It's more relevant for conifers, but that's a great spot to look for mushrooms. Also be sure to check under bushes, on or beside fallen logs, and among the litter of leaves and twigs called duff that cover the forest floor. Many mushrooms like disturbance, so the interface between the forest and the path is a surprisingly good place to look. When you come across a part of the path with lots of fruiting bodies, that is when it's a good idea to selectively go off trail and explore further. So one of my favorite things to do is just walk the path. And it seems counterintuitive because when you're first getting started on mushroom hunting, you're like, I have to go deep into the woods and have to go away from other people. But sometimes the best thing you can do is just walk the path, be observant, and look for mushrooms. And when you find an area that seems to have like a good number, a nice diversity, that's when you can start doing little sort of circle search patterns or like going off and coming back the path. But you don't want to constantly be off the path because A, it's not respectful to the forest. B, it is often a lot of work to like bushwhack through everything and you can get tired. And C, sometimes the best place to see stuff is like right on that edge of disturbance. And it's once you know you're in a good area or patch, that's when you can sort of spend more time looking around. So that's what I'm saying here. While out hiking, remember to slow down and give your eyes time to adjust to small perturbations on the forest floor. Look for colors and patterns of mushrooms that are distinct from plants. Sunlight helps to highlight the unique luminosity of mushrooms, making them stand out against the forest floor. And this is a big one that I think about all the time when I'm out looking at nature, is that mushrooms have a particular kind of glow to them, and sunlight really helps highlight that you're looking at something that is not a plant and it's not a rock, and they just literally have a like I said, the luminosity, the glow. There's a thing about the way that light interacts with mushrooms that when you get kind of keyed into it, you're just like, that's a mushroom. I don't even need to know what it is. I just know it's a mushroom because the way the light is sort of reflecting or making it glow, that looks different from like a leaf or a rock or any of the other organic stuff you might be looking at out there. And that's a sort of visual acuity thing, and you can train yourself in doing that. Pay attention to animal activity, as dig holes and scattered bits of mushrooms can be a sign that there's fruiting bodies nearby. Inherently, many mushrooms are often somewhat hidden as they grow. Frequently, fruiting bodies will push up the duff, thereby forming little humps, affectionately known to foragers as shrumps or mushroom bumps. Learning to spot these shrumps will help you find many more mushrooms, especially prime edible specimens, because sometimes the best ones to eat are still like kind of under the duff and partially covered. You might like often you'll see one big indicator one that's kind of like open up and blown out full of bugs. But if you look in a line or in a circle around that big one, you might find little shrumps or bumps, and then you're going to find like sort of the best mushroom for eating, and one that's not totally mature but is still pretty tight and ideally not full of bugs. And that's very true for something like porcini, you know? Okay. What role do tree and community associations play in finding mushrooms? Another important tip for finding mushrooms is to learn their associations. Many saprotrophic species will fruit only on specific types of wood. For example, lion's mane or hericium prefers growing on hardwoods like oak. Some types of jelly fungus in the Tremeliaceae parasitize the mycelium of other mushrooms in the wood. So looking at other species on the log can help you figure out which species of jelly you have found. ECM, which are the ectomycorrhizal mushrooms, usually fruit around their specific host trees. So understanding the distribution of tree species in your area can help you locate specific mushrooms. Like I was talking about, go to a pine forest to find porcini. That's always a good bet. For example, Matsutake can associate with a variety of conifer and broadleaf trees depending on your geographic area. And Matsutake is an interesting one because it literally translates to pine mushroom. But if you go look for Matsutake under pine in California, you probably won't find them because here in California, you tend to find Matsutake more associated with tan oaks or even spruce as you get up towards Oregon. And so it's always interesting to learn exactly the associations in your area. And that can be one of the things that really helps you level up your foraging, is knowing what kind of forest you're going to for what kind of mushroom you want to hunt at what time of year. Other plants can also help you find edible mushrooms. Dense thickets of undergrowth and ferns create an ideal microclimate for mushrooms to form, i.e. something like the huckleberry bushes here in California. It's a great place to look for mushrooms under those. The mushrooms themselves aren't associated with the huckleberry, but they love the habitat that it creates. Microheterotrophic flowers, like ghost pipes or monotropa, parasitize the mycelium in the soil and can act as an indicator for specific mushroom species. So ghost pipes love to associate with rustlers, brittlegills. And so they're indicative. They're pretty widespread because there's a lot of rustlers all over the place. Whereas Matsutake associates with this thing called sugar stick or Allotropa virgata, which is specific to Matsutake and that association. So that flower can tip you off as to where there's Matsutake mycelium in the ground. And so the flower can be a guide as to where you want to come hunt mushrooms, but often they occur at different times of year. So you can learn about it even in the off season. Fungal associations are also useful, as the presence of some undesirable mushrooms can indicate that the habitat and conditions are right for more desirable edible species to fruit nearby. And what I'm saying about that is, like with reference to porcini, if you find a lot of Amanita muscaria under pine, that often means it's a good area to also find porcini. Okay, is there a correct way to harvest a mushroom? This is a big one. I reject the notion that there's only one correct way to harvest a mushroom. The exact way you harvest or pick a mushroom is going to depend on what species you are foraging and your personal preference. Mushrooms do not have roots like plants, but are connected to the mycelium below by hyphal cords. Regardless of how you do it, when removing a mushroom, do your best to cause minimal disruption to the substrate and the mycelium below. When harvesting mushrooms, clean up after yourself. Be sure to bury or obscure your trimmings instead of leaving them out in the open. This practice is both good for the ecosystem and proper etiquette with regards to foragers and other hikers. So that's just sort of my personal thing, is I hate coming to an area and seeing lots of like open holes and tons of mushroom trimmings, and it just looks like honestly, like bears do this. Bears move through and they just leave a mess. And I hold space for bears. Bears are allowed to do what bears want to do. But humans have free will, and we have a society where we can learn from each other. And it feels really bad to see an area where someone just feels like they've kind of like neglected or disrespected the forest floor. So as much as possible, I like to like pick my mushroom and like trim it back into the soil and kind of obscure some of the evidence that had been there, so it doesn't look quite as like walked over or torn up kind of thing. Okay, and this is a really important discussion, and I have more thoughts on this particular idea, but here's what I wrote in the book. And the question was, when should I cut versus pick a mushroom? For most mycorrhizal mushrooms like boletes and chanterelles, I tend to pick instead of cut because a significant portion of edible stem is below the surface, and I want to maximize the parts I take home as food. For these mushrooms, I trim the dirt off the base of the stem with a knife, then place the cut pieces back into the hole the mushroom grew out of and cover it with surrounding duff. And that's my personal best practice. For mushrooms like matsutakes and amanitas, it is imperative to remove the whole mushroom from the soil, as seeing the stem base is necessary for proper identification. When removing an individual mushroom from a cluster, I use a knife to avoid disturbing the rest, because the rest can keep growing, and I take the one that I want. That's pretty common with something like honey mushrooms. A knife is useful for harvesting fleshy edible polypores, allowing you to cut off the tender growing edges while leaving the base to continue growing. And I do this with stuff like maitake and chicken of the woods, beefsteak polypore. If you pull the whole fruiting body out of the tree, you just remove that mushroom entirely. If you cut part of it and let the other part continue to be on the tree, polypores are indeterminate, so they'll keep growing. And there's a big point of differentiation there between a determinate mushroom, like a bolete or portobello, which is going to grow up and become a big version of itself, versus a polypore, which will continue to grow out in series. So that's determinate versus indeterminate. And I feel more strongly about using a knife to harvest pieces of an indeterminate mushroom without taking the whole thing, because I know it can, in theory, continue to grow out. Sometimes when I'm harvesting maitake, there's like 10 clusters around one tree. So I'm just going to pick a couple of clusters because it's not that big a deal. And I know there's other clusters that keep growing. However, if there's only one big cluster on a tree and it's the only one I'm finding, maybe I'll cut like half that cluster and take it and then leave the other half to keep growing. I do that pretty frequently with something like Berkeley's polypore when I harvest them young and I want the tender edges, but I don't want to take the whole thing. So I cut off some tender edges and I leave the rest to fruit out. So there is nuance to this whole idea, absolutely. Okay, and for harvesting woody conchs and wiry medicinal polypores, and this stuff like turkey tail and artist conch, something like that, try to cleanly break them off or use a tool to help remove the mushroom without causing excessive disturbance to the wood. The best you can, try to not disturb stuff. And inherently, by harvesting something, you're going to disturb it. But you sort of create your own set of best practices around how to do that while being respectful of nature and even respectful of other people who might come and see the space afterwards. And you don't necessarily want it to look like a bear has been through there. You might want to have it look a little less trampled or disturbed, right? Okay, so I'm going to read you guys my actually, you know what? I'm going to wait. I'll wait to read you the best practices and I'll finish reading this chapter and then I will go back and read you my best practices and then also the sidebar on common mushroom misconceptions. So we will come back to mushroom harvesting because I want to keep talking about this. Is there an environmental impact from cutting versus picking your mushrooms? The scientific consensus is that it does not matter whether you cut or pick your mushrooms from the ground, although this does not stop the debate from raging on within the mycology and foraging communities. The assumption is that cutting a mushroom causes less disruption to the mycelium and thus leads to more fruiting bodies in the same spot. That's the assumption. A comprehensive 30-year study performed in Switzerland tested this assumption. The study compared multiple plots where mushrooms were cut versus picked along with control plots and found no significant difference in the number or size of mushrooms between these plots. And these were like multiple plots over multiple areas. It was a well-designed study, and it went on for a long time. Similar results were observed in a parallel 13-year study in Norway. This paper had both the Switzerland study and the Norway study, and they both went on for a significant amount of time. It wasn't like 1 or 2 years. It was 13 and almost 30 years. And this is what the study did reveal. There was no significant difference between the different treatments. There was differences per year, and there's a graph in the book that shows this as the actual data, and it's averaged out. But in theory, there was variations each year depending on like the weather and the conditions. But the treatments of cut versus pick versus no harvest showed no significant difference in the amount of mushrooms that were showing up. But what it did show is that human trampling, i.e. the compaction of soil in areas that were, being walked over, did significantly decrease the number of mushrooms by about 30%, because I think they had some plots that had walkways versus ones that did not have walkways. Although this did not appear to affect the species diversity. So if you compacted the soil, you'd get less mushrooms overall, but the diversity was still similar. It's probably just the mushrooms had a harder time pushing up through the compacted soil. Another 13-year study of chanterelles in Oregon suggested that picking may actually be better for chanterelles since cutting resulted in a slight decrease in the frequency and size of chanterelles. The authors speculated that cutting the mushrooms and leaving the base in the soil left the mycelium exposed to pests and pathogens. And there was a similar study I learned about later with morels where they were showing picking or sort of pinching versus cutting. And I think they concluded sort of a similar idea that pinching or picking might actually be better. But I think in both of those cases, these were the Oregon Forest Service studies. The actual number of mushrooms between the different treatments was kind of insignificant, and the authors were kind of making their best guess based on what they'd seen. And I do think it's interesting because generally what you see the argument online is that cutting is better. That's just universal. Like, I think it's a very sort of European and South American notion, because it's funny because people will comment, people who know nothing about a mushroom, they couldn't ID the mushroom in a video, will tell me, well, with complete certainty that I should be cutting it instead of picking it. I'm a bad person because I'm picking it, and I've gotten death threats over this, multiple death threats because of me tapping and picking a mushroom instead of using a knife. And I use a knife sometimes. The whole point is that use what you want, when you want, how you want, but have at least some framework and guidelines around what your best practices are. And I'll read you mine so you can hear what I think about it. But I think this is it's an absurd notion that humans are having this really defined impact on the appearance of mushrooms when mushrooms have been around for millions upon millions of years longer than humans have. Animals have been eating mushrooms that entire time. Many mushrooms want to be eaten by an animal as their end game. That's kind of their point. And I, again, have followed bears around, and bears don't have a little mushroom knife. They just rip stuff out of the ground and eat it, demolish it, and they leave a big pile of like mushroom, feces and junk all over the place. And the mushrooms dig it. They're into that. And I'm not saying that like we should destroy mushrooms intentionally, but inherently that is often what happens to them in nature, whether it's through insects or bugs or slugs or mold or something. And so I think humans and foragers in particular have a role to play within that ecosystem. And as long as you have some sort of approach that you are comfortable with, I think that's going to be fine, because unlike many other things, we haven't hunted mushrooms to extinction. Mushrooms are still around. Like, if chanterelles were prone to extinction, they wouldn't be here because we've been eating them for a very long time. The dodo bird does not exist anymore, but chanterelles are still mostly around the world, pretty much everywhere where they occur. Okay, here's a great question too about ethics. Should I leave some mushrooms behind? Absolutely. You do not need to bring home every mushroom you see. When harvesting edible mushrooms, I usually leave behind at least a third of what I find in the forest. Specifically, it's best to leave the older, more mature specimens that are already sporulating and past their prime for eating. I am careful to leave most of the young, immature specimens that have not yet started dispersing their spores. These are flexible guidelines that can change depending on the abundance of and type of mushroom you're hunting for. I am less picky with mushrooms like boletes that I know will mold quickly, but more selective when harvesting mushrooms that can grow for a long time, like chanterelles. So I pick porcini buttons pretty small, and even then they'll be like half full of bugs. But I'm not worried about them dispersing their spores, because there'll be plenty of them that get big and spore out, because they're going to do it in something like 7 to 10 days. Chanterelles, however, can grow for like 3 to 4 weeks, even longer. And so picking a tiny button means you're taking away several weeks worth of this mushroom maturing, getting larger and dropping its spores. And so if I'm going to harvest chanterelles, I think really carefully about, all right, here's these big ones, I'm definitely going to leave those. And here's these little ones, I'm going to leave those. Let me take the things that are intermediate and sort of ideal for eating, not too big, not too small. And again, those are flexible guidelines, but that's how I operate. And there's a thing from Braiding Sweetgrass where she sort of says, don't take the first and don't take the last. And I think that's a good guideline too. I usually sort of go with, I'll just leave about a third of what I find out there, and it's usually the rattier ones, the ones that have insects in them. I take the ones that I want to eat, and if I have enough, I stop taking them, because you don't need to take everything home, right? Just take what you can use. Generally, you want to only take prime specimens for consumption and leave the rest untouched to disperse their spores and serve as food for animals. What kind of gear do you use to collect wild edible mushrooms? The gear you need for mushroom hunting is usually pretty minimal. My favorite item is a lightweight knife with a brush attached, a camera or phone to document my finds, and some kind of hand lens or macro lens to examine the fine details of a specimen. For collecting mushrooms, be sure to bring a decent-sized breathable container that is comfortable to carry for an extended period of time. Fair trade, African style, Alethea woven baskets are ideal given giving the best combination of carrying capacity and flexibility, but other versions of woven or wicker baskets will work just as well. Mesh bags are also popular, but they have a tendency to damage fragile mushrooms over the course of foraging. I don't like using mesh bags at all. They shred your mushrooms. Canvas bags work, but they can get waterlogged, and mushrooms at the bottom of the bag will get squished. And I've had that issue many times. Paper bags work, but are prone to getting wet and falling apart. I've also had that happen where you're carrying around mushrooms and the bottom falls out. So if you want to use paper bags, it's better to use when it's drier outside, and maybe double bag at least. Plastic bags are convenient because they're easy to like stuff in your pocket, but not ideal. Your mushrooms will get soggy, but a plastic bag can do in a pinch. And there's some people out there who are militant about never letting their mushrooms touch plastic. I don't really like storing mushrooms in plastic necessarily, but I don't care about like if you're just picking some, having a random bag and having them in there for like an hour, it's fine. Just don't leave your mushrooms in plastic because they can't breathe and they'll get all sweaty and weird, and you don't want mycelium growing on the plastic. There's questions there about microplastics and stuff like that. But if you have nothing, a plastic bag will do in a pinch. You can also just end up using your shirt or your pants or some version of that. But sometimes it's easier to like grab like a random plastic bag out of your car if you just happen to find a big flush of mushrooms. There's nothing wrong with that. You can also like use a cardboard box, or I sometimes keep various types of containers in my car just in case I find a big flush of mushrooms and I need something to hold them in. So small wax or deli bags can be used to help keep samples separate, although this is more useful for collecting scientific specimens than foraging. You can get some big lunch bag size things to use to keep your mushrooms separate. But again, paper bags will get wet and fall apart pretty easily. And the wax bags are small enough that it's great to like hold a specimen or two. But if you're actually out hunting edible mushrooms, like one chanterelle can be bigger than a single wax bag. So it's not like a useful way to like bag up every single mushroom individually. Tackle boxes, berry containers, and sort of clamshell type things, and egg cartons are ideal for collecting and transporting fragile mushrooms that are prone to breaking. And that's a great point. If you want to go out and collect scientific stuff, an egg crate is a low-tech version, or a sample, like a little a tackle box is great for just lots of tiny, tiny things. You don't want to get them destroyed, and you want to bring them in and have someone sequence them or look at them under a microscope. They will get crushed in a basket or a bag. So I've got a list here of interesting things to bring out into the field with you that I'll read off, along with some pictures of my friends. I got Gabrielle Serverville, who I quoted earlier, holding a Lexinum or a Scaberstock from when she came and visited me. There's me and Maria Pinto here with a maitake mushroom that Maria showed me how to find in Massachusetts. And then my buddy Sean Hernandez, who I did some filming with and made some great sort of webisodes with a couple years ago, holding a basket of mushrooms up there in Mendo. So the gear that I bring out into the field with me, and this is a picture from Tay Bright, who's a SOMA board member with me, and she was working as a collector for Fundus, this California fungal diversity survey thing. So she was going out and professionally like hunting and cataloging and getting mushrooms photographed, ready for sequencing as part of a sort of a actual like initiative to survey all the fungi in California. So here's what she said she would bring in the field with her. So she was using wax paper bags to keep specimens separate because she wasn't necessarily foraging for mushrooms. She was picking things for science. She had a bear spray for protection. That's never a bad idea if you're out in the woods, especially alone. An ultraviolet flashlight, 365 nanometer. That's a really good one for using to help with identification. It's cool for photography. UV lights are just interesting to have. And the 365 is not that super purple one. It's more of a blue light and it won't wash out your photographs as much. A lightweight curved knife with a brush. I particularly like the Opinel brand, but you can use any one you want. I don't love big, heavy, all metal knives or ones that are just kind of like really big and bulky because I just don't find them useful. I like a small knife that folds, and I like the attached brush. It is a nice feature when you have a dirty mushroom, kind of helps you like field dress the mushroom a little bit. And the curved blade helps a lot too to not cut yourself when you're trying to like trim or clean mushrooms. Tay was bringing out voucher tags with little cataloging collections, and that was a barcoding thing that Fundus was using to keep track of all the different samples. A phone for documenting their finds and geolocation, a tackle box for protecting and organizing small specimens, a whistle, just in case you got separated or needed to make some noise, potassium hydroxide, which is KOH. It's a like 5% basic solution to help stain a mushroom, helps with identification. A macro lens for a phone, so you can get closer. A hand lens for observation, so you can kind of like, really get up close with something. Water-resistant notepad and pencil, to want to take notes. Hori hori, or sort of like a digging knife, to get in and dig stuff up from the ground, whether it's truffles, or you want to like dig down and try to bring a mushroom up by the base so you get the whole specimen. And then a measuring tape, because she was trying to measure specimens to have a physical thing. So, the ones I usually bring are like a macro lens, a knife, and a phone. But, other gear is also helpful. So, okay, I am going to read to you my best practices for mushroom hunting, and then I'm going to do a quick rundown of some of the most common rules that will be quoted at you in like a mushroom foraging space and exceptions to those rules. Okay, so here's my best practices for mushroom hunting. The long history of human foraging practices, systemic scientific studies, and anecdotal evidence all indicate that individuals' harvesting of mushrooms is sustainable behavior. So basically, we have, centuries worth of mushroom hunting, scientific studies, and lots of people saying it's all okay to hunt mushrooms. We haven't made them go extinct yet. Responsibility is a built-in requirement of foraging and spending time in nature. Every time you go out searching for wild foods, you are taking your own life in your hands. Eating the wrong plant or mushroom can be a deadly mistake. However, the inherent responsibilities of a forager extend beyond personal safety. If you benefit from taking food from nature, then you have a duty to protect the land that provides for you. Here are some suggestions that can help you forage ethically, meaning your activities help support and foster healthy foraging habits. And this is speaking to what Gabrielle was talking about. Okay, so here's my best practice, right? Look up and follow local rules and regulations for collecting mushrooms. Always a good idea. Obtain permits and or permission for the land you're foraging on when necessary. It's not always necessary, but certainly in some places it is. You don't want to, get the cops calling you because you're looking for mushrooms on someone's property. In general, when foraging, take only what you need and can reasonably use, or at least share with friends and family. Do not get greedy. Leave some behind for animals that eat mushrooms, including other foragers. Use what you take. Be ready to process and preserve your forage foods. And that's a big one. It feels real bad to like bring mushrooms home and let them go bad in the fridge because you were lazy. So if you're going to pick something, make sure you have the time to process it and preserve it, or turn it into food at least. Carry your mushrooms in a breathable container, like a mesh bag or woven basket. Talked about that. That will allow you to continue dispersing spores as you move around. That's one of the things you can do stewardship-wise. If you're going to pick mushrooms and take them out of the woods, at least make sure as you're moving around, the spores are getting dispersed. Learn to recognize invasive plant species and remove them, especially if they are edible. That's a great point, right? If you're out in the woods hunting mushrooms, but you're surrounded by lots of tasty edible plants, if they're invasive, you have every right to take those out, turn them into food. Something like the tricornered leek here in California makes a phenomenal kind of green onion leek, onion pesto kind of thing going on. It's really tasty, and it's out in droves right now, and it's invasive. So do your part, help remove it. Clean and sanitize the soles of your shoes between hikes to avoid spreading pathogens between different areas. It's as simple as just like dipping your bottom of your boots or shoes in a really like weak bleach solution. Make like a 5-10% bleach solution with some water and just a little like, foot mat thing, and dip your boots in. And then when you go from area to area, you're not spreading any pathogens around. When possible, stay on trails and establish paths so as not to compact the forest floor. When you do go off path, like when you find a nice little area, avoid trampling plants and causing collateral damage to the habitat. So just be careful where you step. Help make the forest cleaner than when you came. Carry an extra bag for picking up trash, especially plastics and metal that do not biodegrade. Whenever possible, leave no trace. Treat natural spaces with reverence and respect. And this is what I was talking about. If you go to an area and you're hunting mushrooms and you've been there for like 20 minutes picking, try to make it look a little less like it's been run over by a train. Fold, cover the holes back up, put some of your trimmings away, just in case someone else stumbles across the spot. It doesn't feel good to feel like someone has disrespected the land. So, like I said, do your best to, make it seem like you haven't been there. at least, don't throw your trash out, right? I'm encouraging people to pick up their trash. And again, I don't love seeing stuff like banana peels or orange peels in the woods, but they do eventually biodegrade, although they really like catch your eye and you sort of fixate on seeing the trash that people left behind. But stuff like glass, plastic, and metal don't biodegrade. So those are things you should be packing out. But you can also pack out someone's orange peels if you're sick of seeing them. And I do that sometimes. So here's the final one. Lead by example, practice what you preach, and think about how your behavior can influence others. And that's part of why I put this in the book, because I figured it was a really important thing for me to outline my practices and help other people learn from that in the hopes that they will adopt their own. And it's going to be different for everyone. The way you do it is going to be different. But I do encourage everyone who forages and is interested in taking anything from nature to think about how they can give back and support nature and play a role in stewardship. And I talk about that more, I think, at the end of chapter 10, but something to keep in mind. Okay, so here are some general rules for foraging and wild mushrooms, because people always have something that they've heard, and let's talk about it. So aphorisms and anecdotal advice are rampant within the mushroom foraging community. While these rules can be a good starting point for beginner foragers, all these common sayings have exceptions or just plain incorrect. And that's part of what I'm going through in this little bit right here. So the first one says, avoid eating all mushrooms with gills. This is advice I've heard people give to others, and it's sort of like, why? Why would you do that? A common piece of advice often given to beginner foragers. Not eating gilled mushrooms can help you avoid many of the poisonous species, but you'll also be missing out on a huge number of delicious varieties of mushrooms. There are many poisonous mushrooms that lack gills, so this is inherently flawed advice. And I think generally what they're saying is, with this, is they're saying stick to polypores or maybe boletes, as the chance of eating something is toxic is lower if you're sticking to not gilled mushrooms. And I start out my edible section by going through edible polypores and edible boletes because those are some of the easiest to recognize. But I also do talk about edible gilled mushrooms because there's plenty of good gilled mushrooms that, are safe to eat. You just have to learn about them. White gilled mushrooms are deadly poisonous. This rule is meant to help beginners avoid picking and eating poisonous amanitas. However, there are also a number of edible mushrooms with white gills, including prized edible mushrooms like matsutake or like an oyster mushroom. There's plenty of things that have white gills that are edible. There are some things that have white gills that are toxic, but it's better to learn species by species than just ignore something based on like no white gills, right? That doesn't make sense because there's exceptions to all of these quote unquote rules. Mushrooms growing in grass are safe to eat. And I see Europeans sometimes stating this, and it freaks me out because in North America, we have a pretty toxic mushroom that does grow in grass. So here's what I said. A number of relatively common edible species grow in grass, like meadow mushrooms, which are agaricus. There are some non-edible agaricus, like the yellow sanders, that also grow in grass, but you can learn to differentiate those. Puffballs, or lycoperdon, are also pretty common in grass. But many toxic mushrooms also grow in grass, like the false parasol, also known as the vomiter. Guess what happens if you eat that? Chlorophyllum molybdes, and Tier's lepidella, Saproamanita thursii, and that's a common white mushroom that's like spreading around parts of the U.S. And it's toxic. And so the advice of like eat anything that grows in grass is bad advice because you could eat something toxic, and it's better to like learn again species by species than making an assumption and being incorrect or hurting someone. Note, beware when foraging in grass that has been treated with pesticides like a cemetery or big field. The mushrooms can bioaccumulate heavy metals and environmental toxins, especially stuff like puffballs and amanitas will suck up the minerals and the heavy metals from the ground and concentrate them in a mushroom. So if there's an area that you see a mushroom in, but it's been treated years on end with various types of pesticides or things to control weed growth, you might not want to collect and eat mushrooms there. And that's a common thing in grassy areas in particular. Boletes that stain blue are poisonous. And again, I hear this a lot from Europeans, and it's not as relevant for North Americans. In Europe, I was looking at it, and there is a species of bolete called imperpator. It's a genus called imperpator, and it stains blue, and they're toxic, but we don't get those in North America. And so I talk about what's relevant to North America here. Many bolete species stain blue when cut or bruised due to the enzymatic oxidation of organic acids in the mushroom flesh. The blue staining in boletes is not due to psychotropic alkaloids like psilocybin. It is actually an organic acid being enzymatically catalyzed to turn blue through an oxidation. Despite this ominous appearance, the blue staining reaction is not an indicator of toxicity. The poisonous Satan's bolete, Rubroboletus, stains blue, but so do a number of other good edible bolete species like butter boletes, jacks or swillus, scabrostalks, lexinum, and there's just a bunch of boletes that'll stain blue, and many of them are edible. Not all of them are good, mind you, but you can eat them and they're not toxic. And so there are a couple of boletes like the Rubroboletus and Purputor that stain blue that are toxic, but there's a larger number of edible boletes that stain blue that are not toxic. Okay, and this is also relevant. Do not eat boletes with red pores. This is the toxic Satan's bolete, Rubroboletus, has red pores. However, other boletes with red pores are edible when cooked, like frost bolete, Exudoporus, witch's bolete, Neoboletus, and liver boletes, or Swillellus. I mean, I think there's at least, one or two other boletes that have kind of red orangish pores and stain blue that are edible when cooked. You just should avoid eating Rubroboletus. And I've also gotten to a couple disagreements with people online where there's Italians who say that they'll eat Rubroboletus after they boil it like 3 times. And I'm very skeptical of that because the toxin that's in Rubroboletus is a peptide, so it's in the mushroom flesh itself. And in theory, it's not heat liable, so it can't be broken down by heat. You might be able to extract it with water if it's water soluble, but I would still be very skeptical of that, and I would not personally choose to eat Rubroboletus. There are other red pored boletes that stain blue that I have cooked and eaten, and a lot of them are kind of musty. They're not super good. I do like the frost bolete though on the East Coast. It's like light and lemony and quite tasty. But always keep in mind that there's exceptions to all these rules. If animals are eating a mushroom, then it's safe for you to eat. This is patently false. Whether they are slugs, bugs, birds, or small mammals, animals have different tolerances and sensitivities to the toxins in mushrooms than humans do. Our metabolism and bodies are fundamentally different from other animals. What might be safe for a squirrel to consume could be toxic for us. And so if you see an animal eating a mushroom, it doesn't mean that that animal is like a mushroom expert ID. It might make a mistake and run off and die somewhere. And if you eat that same mushroom, you might also die. So typically, it is better just learn how to identify a mushroom and not rely or put your health in the hands of an animal. Right? That seems like common sense, but I see this kind of thing on the internet all the time. There's even something I've seen, it's not in here, but people say, if you like put a copper coin on a mushroom or silver or something on a mushroom and it stains the color, like there's these absurd like old wives' tales that like might be relevant to like one kind of mushroom, but are like not relevant to other types of mushrooms, and people will take them as like a general rule. And that's what scares me, and that's why I put this section here in the book and I'm talking about it. Don't trust your life to an animal. You are an animal, and you can trust yourself because you can learn about it and get confirmation and do all these things. However, a squirrel is not going to vet things the same way that you can. If it's small and brown, throw it down. Sound advice for avoiding potentially toxic mushrooms like funeral bells or Galerina and fiber tops and nasipi. However, you would miss out on excellent edible mushrooms like candy caps, Lactarius rubidus, and fairy ring mushrooms or Marasmius oretes. And those are small brown mushrooms. So typically you don't want to go around eating small brown mushrooms, but there are some tasty ones, like I said. And so, as always, there's an exception to every rule, and that's part of what I'm helping to teach you guys. So the last one here is all polypores that grow on wood are safe to eat. And there are a variety of large fleshy polypores that are edible and easy for beginners to identify. However, at least one genus of toxic polypore grows on wood, called cinnamon brackets or Haplopilus. Many, but not all polypores that grow on the ground, the terrestrial polypores, are also edible, but there are a few exceptions to ones that aren't. And so, in general, if you hear someone quoting one of these rules, there's always going to be exceptions to it, which is why I think it's better to focus on learning the mushrooms than trying to memorize some sort of rule which is incorrect and potentially even problematic in terms of the way that it could harm people because it's incomplete in its information. So I know a lot of people just want to reduce foraging down to, leaves of three, let it be kind of thing, but that's not how mushroom foraging works. In fact, usually what I tell people is it's akin to like starting an RPG, a role-playing game, and you're a level one character, and all you know how to do is like spam fireball. You can cast fireball, but you don't know any other spells. And that's when you're getting started on hunting mushrooms. Maybe someone showed you what a chanterelle is. So that's your fireball. You go out and you slay a bunch of zombies and rats in the basement using your fireball to level up. As you're leveling up, you're out in the woods, you're seeing other mushrooms, and you start to get curious. You pick stuff up, you look at it, you get familiar with it, and boom, you've leveled up. Now you know how to identify like a black trumpet and a hedgehog. You just learned whirlwind and lightning bolt, and you can cast more spells, i.e., become a higher level mushroom character by going and spending more time in the woods and learning the mushrooms one by one. And that's what my book is really aimed at helping you do, is trying to become familiar with the basics, learn what's safe, and then build on that experience rather than trying to enter with something like, don't eat guild mushrooms, and then, having a flawed perception of what it is to go out and forage mushrooms and make sense of what you're finding in the woods. So if you like what I do, please pick up a copy of my book, Passport to Kingdom Fungi. It's available online everywhere books are sold. If you'd like to get signed copies, check out the link in the description on this video from the Napa Book Mine. You can order signed copies. I can even personalize it for you if you'd like. I also have the companion guide to my book, which is a little bit better to bring into the field with you and has like a journaling component. If you want to learn more from me, check out my classes at Cabrillo College. And if you've enjoyed this, please leave a review, comment, or engage with us and share it with your friends and family. I would really appreciate that. So thank you guys for being here, and stay fascinated by fungi. Till next time. Bye.